you consider that in Wisconsin that it gets really cold. So there are some extra considerations there, but we do recognize there's a lot of different players when it comes to housing. And one question that came to mind was, how do you incentivize people at different sides of the equation to be involved in making change to help everyone have a roof over their head and provide ways that people can have a path to homeownership and be given a return? And one other question that came up we're trying to think through is, so, okay, maybe you give away for the first person to buy the first place to live at a reasonable price rate. But when they sell it and then the market says they can sell it for this, well, that's great for them. They made all this money, and maybe it's a diverse person who lived there who made a lot of money. But what about the next person? How do you keep them from having to pay this price? How can you keep them from buying this, but also reward that home ownership? And there's just some difficult questions, and we're not going to solve everything, especially in 6 months. So just we're thinking through options of what voices we should amplify, what interest groups we should be listening to, and that's where we're at right now. Maggie or Chris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think our next steps are really learning more about from different phases. So like we want to meet with Occupy Madison and ask some of the questions more about their projects. And something that we really were thinking about is like, can this be, instead of being just like in lot areas that are like big and kind of, I think there's one on the north side where the Wiggy's Bar and Grill used to be. Could they be throughout the neighborhoods too? So they're not just in one place, but kind of spread throughout the city and creating like that fostering that belonging, but also, you know, maybe they thought about that. Should we let's educate ourselves? So like really talking about like, what are some next steps? What are some ways we can advocate and can we connect with, the next steps after they leave and they're trying to get an apartment or they're trying to buy their first home themselves. And then really connecting with, building developers and saying, how does like affordable housing work into, when you're building these apartment complexes, like how does that work and what kind of permits do you need, and seeing if there's a way to really connect all three to being able to work together, so that people can have a long-term plan for sustainable housing for themselves.
And one more thing that Maggie was saying, so I think there's probably some sort of preconceived notions people would have about housing that looks different than what they think housing should look like. So one thought was, how can we destigmatize what non-traditional housing could look like? So if they were throughout the neighborhoods and it's just a normal thing of like, this is part of a healthy community, is that just like people look different, housing can look different, and don't think of anyone who lives in them any less. It's another opportunity for people to have a place over their head. And so that might be a challenge we can explore.
Hey, Lynn, great. Before we move on to the next one, I was just to let you guys know, I'm an architect. I did my thesis on that. And so I worked with East St. Louis, the Eagles Nest, which we are homeless veterans. And we worked to create like communities and then transitional housing where it was like a base house or, and then they could transition into different neighborhoods and communities. So if you want, I could talk to you guys about that.
Yes.
Awesome. Excellent. I love to hear that. Sharing resources. Please.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, you did rightly identify the fact that that is the next phase of this is, you come together right now and based on what you've heard and what you know, and it is kind of carving out what additional information you need to have in order to begin to move forward. As you can imagine, this stage of information gathering could be huge and you could go on forever and ever. So be really, really kind of tight in the information you're going to go after. That's why posing these questions, and I've seen lots of you have already kind of come up with what those questions are that you want to get answered, asking them of many voices, and being able to have resources right here among your classmates is awesome. So that is the next stage. So thank you. And I love the, what voices need to be amplified. Those are great kinds of questions to be asking because they're not the questions everyone is asking. So thank you. All right, how about the economic recovery group? Is there someone who could update us on your thinking?
Sure, I'll go. Hi again, everybody. I met, Diara and Derek and I met virtually to discuss economic recovery. And two of the big things that we were focusing on in terms of the questions that we came up with the challenges that are being faced now. One is, how can equity be ensured in economic recovery? So any kind of plans that are already in place or any new plans that come about to help stabilize economic recovery in our community, how can we make sure that that is equitably distributed? So that the areas of greatest needs, whether that's a geographic area, whether it is an area of the business itself, like arts or entertainment or hospitality or food and beverage, how can we make sure that the funds are distributed in a way that is equitable to participants in that area? The other thing that we really talked about is community investment and community accountability. What goes into a cultural shift? What goes into a personal shift and having people invest in the businesses that are in their neighborhoods? And more, it's less about investing money, although that certainly is a component of it, but it's more about making a personal investment or personal commitment. Like, this is a business in my neighborhood. I want them to do well so my neighborhood can do well. What can I give to this business in terms of time or money or resources? Besides word of mouth advertising, what can I give to this business that then helps that business do better and gives back to the community? And how can we create a cycle where that perpetuates itself, that businesses and communities grow together by investing in each other? So, so we asked those questions. We didn't answer them. We thought we'd wait until next month to answer them, but we'll have it then.
The world awaits. The world awaits your questions. You're the answer, so that's good.
And so one thing that came up in one of the sections is, our goal is to transform the way that communities invest in small businesses and support their growth, evolution, and sustainability. And so that deals both with, the economic and opportunistic equity, as well as that personal investment. So some, benefits that we thought of were, definitely increased business growth, equity for all, additional employment opportunities, which always helps the community, and bringing awareness of current community pitfalls around economic development. But then on the flip side of that, we thought a disadvantage or a con would be that people are going to be very comfortable investing with businesses that already look like them or already are in the neighborhood. So if we set up a model where people can support businesses, how can we ensure that equity? How can we ensure that broader diversity of businesses? So it's not just, oh, it's in my neighborhood, or these people look like me, or this business provides a service that I personally want. How can we expand that thinking to the greater good and make it we instead of me? The drink means
Great.
I'm done.
Excellent. Anybody on that team want to expand at all?
This is Diara. I think Whitney did a great job summarizing. Thank you, Whitney. I think I would just underscore that community accountability and equity were two of the core focus areas. And we we had a really great conversation and absolutely came up with more questions than answers, which I know is, the point. It's a really, really big issue. And when you're using that equity lens as well, there are lots of nuances and complexities and lots of people to think about, and unintended consequences and all of those things. So we were asking a lot of questions about that, and so we're excited to dive in more and talk to experts. I mean, a few of us said that, I'll speak for myself, but this was not an area that I was anticipating that I would choose, but it's something that's newer for me, and so I said, why not? And so I think that it'll be a fun challenge, an interesting challenge, and I think we'll learn a lot. So yeah, we're excited to dive in more.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Diara. I do think that that's important, kind of putting yourself, it's very comfortable sometimes to go into areas we're really familiar with, and there's very great value there. And sometimes it's good to explore. So it sounds like a lot of things will come together in that discussion as well. All right, thank you. Let's hear from the educational equity group, please.
I'm happy to start, team, and if you want to jump in, I see Kelly smiling. You're on my video here. One of the, for us, we met last week, and I think we spent much of our time trying to narrow our focus of what we wanted to really start to investigate, because I think, and group chime in here, please, but when we were having conversations coming out of last week's marathon of presenters, I think in the education piece, we were all looking for that lightning rod, or that one thing that gravitated, that pulled us in to say, this is what we want to work on. And I speak for myself, and I think the team wasn't like, okay, you know, we recognized this data point was something that we should focus on because it will have high impact, or this. And then as many are parents as well, I think you have your own bend comes in a little bit on things that you have experienced or seen or want to help or know was a challenge. And we were fortunate enough to work through it, but then not everybody has that. So we spent probably a good chunk of our time just trying to say, okay, you have everything from pre-K, frankly, all the way to college. And the pandemic has only made, you know, a system that was so frail and struggling in so many ways, so much worse. At the same time, a new superintendent and others was coming in. So where we landed was, we think we've identified that we want to work on, but we're all going to take some time and really start to have conversations about, is it talking to the youth from an equity perspective at more the middle school age to understand, how do we find, is it internships? What do we do to help kids? Because we think there's a lot of great programs out there, but they're getting to the kids too late, frankly. And some of those decisions would be lost or were not there. So that's where we left. And we said we were going to regroup and make sure everybody had kind of wrapped their arms around where we wanted to focus. And then we'd start to slowly unpack this and ask more questions and look to who to lean into. Many people on the team are either in the space already or have resources. So for us, it was getting more tight on our ideas. So I'm going to be quiet and invite the team to chime in.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we had a great conversation on Friday, and, we were trying to like narrow it down, but there's so many things and so many angles that we can focus on. We also talked about, maybe we'll talk with parents, maybe we'll do something with parents, because they're, in a way, they're the ones initiating the pathway for the kids, right? Or maybe we need to talk with counselors at schools and do something there. But I think we just kind of narrowed down, and we're trying to like, figure it out. But also we kind of focused a little bit about, and we talked about, how do we, in a way, how do we start training or at least share information about different career pathways, so then those students will be able to have a better career, a better employment opportunity in the future. Not just a school setting, but also, Matt talked about different trades that, different other areas where, not at school is not the only choice. There are also other ways, other career opportunities that, we can also be able to share. Some parents or students might not be aware of trades or different ways to get into schools. So in a way, we just kind of want to, how can we bring that information to the kids? Great. And Lynn, maybe we're gonna have this more of this information, but I was just, talking with the team too, maybe if there is a way that we can kind of know what other class did in the past, so that we can kind of have an idea of how deep do we want to go into this project, or how far, because I know it's a very limited time and December is gonna be here anytime soon. I don't know if that could be possible.
Great, it's a great question. I will certainly share resources about what previous classes have done. I never want to do that at the beginning, because first of all, it's out of context, and I want your thinking to, kind of progress in a way that is much more organic, so that you're going through the process together. I will definitely share resources. And even along those lines, we have had many conversations. I think that we do the leadership Greater Madison Youth That's for high school students. We have been approached about, doing middle school sort of focus. So, we can share resources about that. I know Tara and I have talked too a little bit about youth leadership and some things like that. So if there are some overlaps there, we can talk about that. So yes, we'll come back to kind of the mechanics of sort of sharing some of those pieces, but this is exactly the kind of thinking that we wanted you to be having at this stage. All right, and we just have a couple more minutes, but I want to have enough time for our public safety and public safety / gun violence team to update us.
I can jump in there. So I feel like we had a really good group meeting because there was a lot of conversations and it was really good. And I think if anything, our struggle was trying to find a question, but it was because once we would ask that up, we started coming up with like answers on like what it could be. So that's one of the good problems to have is it was tough to kind of leave a question unanswered. We always had like an idea of how it would go, but the things that we kind of focused on with the 3, just because we can, I think guns are always going to be in this country, either if we make it legal or illegal. So it was one of those of how do we work with it in our communities. And the 3 things that we wanted to kind of focus on with those in terms of public safety and gun violence is training the people that are gun owners and how to be responsible gun owners, mentorship, because the people are the ones that are controlling the guns themselves. So kind of having a mentor in their life, or giving them the option to have a mentor if and when they want one, and then having equitable funding. And this was kind of like our biggest piece in terms of like having locations kind of spread around the community, aimed at each location would be for a different age group, kind of having spots again, kind of how back in the day there was like arcades or skate parks or just places for people to kind of go to. So they're essentially they're busy, right? And not necessarily giving them the chance to be bored, then have them find more eccentric ways to cure that boredom. But those 3 things were kind of the 3 that we really wanted to focus on in terms of giving us a starting point for this. And there was a lot of really good conversation around that in terms of how, like, what does good training excuse me, what does good training look like? Is it just like an online thing, or does it have to be like an in-person class, or how often? And then again, like the whole community centers aspect too was what I would consider like the biggest topic that we kind of delved into the most. But the questions, where do they go? Oh, so the questions that I kind of pulled from that conversation was how do we gauge interest in the idea of is it just like a town hall that we would kind of set up, or do we got to probe deeper and kind of get to the people that actually need these centers? How is it funded? Is it going to be a publicly owned thing, or is it a privately owned thing? And what rules or guidelines do we set for those? And how mentors? How do we know if there's not enough or what do we do if there's not enough mentors that are willing to help the community? What's our next step with that, in terms of making sure that there's an outlet for people to go to reach out to these mentors to kind of use as their role models in the community. So I don't know if someone else wants to chime in if I missed anything.
I just wanted to add that we did specifically name mentorship as Black male, like increasing and supporting Black male mentorship, and mentorship that more aligned with the demographic of people who are most at risk for the gun violence or being victimized by gun violence. And so it was not just the concept of creating more mentors, because I think that if we look at that, we've got a decent amount of mentors. What we lack is mentors that align in identity as far as racial, socioeconomic, and even generational with the youth, again, that are most at risk for the behavior or to be victimized by gun violence. And we also talked about educating on gun safety, that same demographic. So not just responsibility for owners, but also what it really looks like to operate safely, manage a firearm for people who are utilizing and getting access to them illegally without any support or education.
Great refinement. Excellent. Well, I think we have a community waiting for the work that you are all doing. And I'm going to just say one more time, I'm going to continue to say this, but I know that you are, there's a lot that you can do. There is a lot of outcome that you will have. I'm sure of it. You will pursue tangible things that you can get done. And that's great. But those are bonuses. Remember that the process of thinking through issues like this and coming up with, sustainable leadership approaches to making change is the real outcome that we're after. So, this idea of not wanting to reinvent the wheel, that's great, but learning the thinking that was behind something that might already be done is equally important. So anyway, I just want to make sure that I posit that thought again and keep it top of mind, because I think it'll be important as you go through trying to create projects. So excellent work. I want to give you your break. Let's come back at 10 o'clock and we will move into our panel discussions. Thank you all. Recording. And now you all know it's being recorded, so anything you say is going to be recorded. We are still having a confidential discussion anyway within this group, but are so pleased to have all of you here. As you heard, we are looking at the kind of concept of the importance of neighborhoods in community health, and all the various aspects. And Madison is such a kind of rich, has such a rich and diverse geographic set of neighborhoods and communities, and we've asked all of you here to just sort of share the perspectives that you have of these different communities, and to give information that will be helpful as we kind of go out and do some additional exploration in these different geographic areas in the community. So I think I'm going to just open it up with you, Justice, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about Commonwealth. And I know you are working on an effort that is sort of supporting neighborhoods. So if you could just give us a little bit of background on you and your work, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, cool, great. First, good morning to everybody. It's great to see some folks that I've met before. Everyone else, it's great to meet you and see you for the first time. That started off like I was going to say, great to see some folks, but not so many, some of you other. No, it's not that at all. Good morning. Commonwealth Development. My name is Justice Castaneda. I'm the executive director here at Commonwealth. I've been here for 51 months. I'm actually from Madison. I left for 19 years and came back 51 months ago. So yeah, it's been interesting. Madison never disappoints, even when it's disappointing. But Commonwealth has been around for 43 years. It was founded as actually a violence prevention initiative on the east side here in the Market neighborhood. Historically, there's different schools of thinking about how you address violence. A school of thought is that it's not program-based, right? So what these guys did here, 1979, there were shootings. The building that Commonwealth works out of right now actually had someone get shot. It was Lake House Tavern, and someone died in front of it. And so the city shut down all the bars on Willie Street and only left the Crystal Corner and what became, well, it was called the Amstel Inn, but it became the Willie Bear, which became Jolly Bowser, became Baraka. Those two places were allowed to open back up. But what they did is they bought a bunch of housing, and they bought a bunch of property, and they started creating low-income housing. And then after that, they created two of the oldest business incubators in the country. But in terms of actual calling it an incubator, they're some of the first ones, definitely the oldest ones in Dane County. They created two of those to create a local economy. And so today, you name the business like Shop Bop, Wildwood Productions, Old Sugar Distillery, RP's Pasta, Yum Butter, EVP Coffee, a lot of the coffee things, the Madison Recycling Program, all these things came out of these incubators here on the East Side. And if you think about what that does in terms of creating opportunities for jobs and all these things, it's really critical. So they did that, and then they started doing workforce development training. And today we are the largest single residential property owner in the Marquette neighborhood. We do low-income housing. We also do economic development work. So we have workforce development programs for both youth. We're in all 4 high schools plus some Prairie, and then we're at Toki Middle School and Cherokee Middle School doing trainings around financial literacy through financial mastery. So there's kind of a gradient that we talk about. It's literacy, fluency, and then mastery in terms of finances and just personal economics. And then we also do adult work, transitional employment programs. So folks who are coming right out of prison or right off the streets, we can employ them. And then what we do is we work with them, and it's a 3-job model, meaning the first job they get is with us. The second job is the one that we're hoping to get them placed in within 6 months, where they're going to get, somewhere between $10 and $12 an hour. And then really what we're working with them on is that third job, which we're hoping gets them into that living wage category. And then our business incubation. So we have those business incubators. So there's about 50 businesses, small businesses here that work out of our incubators. And then we have our annual gala. You all are invited to. It's called the Willie Street Fair. So we do that every year, and that's kind of Commonwealth in a nutshell. We work also in 2011. We started working with our partners in Meadowood neighborhood, and so we've been working in collaboration with a number of really amazing people in the Meadowood neighborhood for the last 10 years. And we have a building that's opening up there any day now, not soon enough. So it should be open pretty quick here. And we're going to be working with JFF and ECI. And that's Commonwealth in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thanks, Justice. Can you just clarify? I know you mentioned Marquette neighborhood, Marquette area. Can you just give some additional sort of geographic indicators of what area you're talking about?
It's a great point, and everyone gets very colloquial and parochial with their geographies. But no, the Marquette neighborhood, what I'm talking, we have properties really starting around, if you include, we'll just say the 900 block all the way up to the 1500 block of Willie Street. We have properties throughout. We have one big, it's the only low-income housing development on the Isthmus that's low income. It's 55 to 60 units at Main Street. It's the Hart Riverview Apartments, which is at 1459 Main Street, right there. But then the rest of it is scattered site in and around the Marquette neighborhood. So I guess on the southern boundary, Spate Street. On the northern boundary is Main Street. On the eastern boundary is actually the river. And the western boundary, I think, is, well, the building at Brearley Street is kind of your geography that you're working with. In Meadowood, almost all of our properties are at the intersection of Balsam and Leland, pretty much. And then our building that we're building right now is at 5802 Raymond Road. And our office space on the west side is at 5902 Raymond Road.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, entree to Meadowood. That was a nice transition. So if we can turn it over to Terry, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Sure. So thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. Meadowood, I'm president of the Meadowood Neighborhood Association, which is a completely voluntary group. All of the neighborhoods in Madison, neighborhood associations are, and I've held that role of president for going on 5 years. I myself, my husband and I moved into Meadowood 6 months after we were married, and that was about 41 years ago. So we've lived in the same home for 41 years and been part of this neighborhood. The neighborhood itself is basically bisected. The center of the neighborhood is, we've got Whitney Way running north and south and Raymond Road running east and west. And the intersection of those two main roads are about the center of the neighborhood. And Justice just alluded to the housing that Commonwealth owns and manages in the Balsam Leland area. And we have the only commercial area we have in our neighborhood is called the Meadowood Shopping Center, and it's a small strip mall right there at that intersection. And immediately behind, that is to the north, I think of it as behind, but immediately north for about maybe a 4-block area that runs between Whitney Way and Cameron is another area of multifamily low-income housing. And so our apartments and the center of the neighborhood are, defined by those apartments. Most, not all of which, but many of which are low income. And surrounding all that, there's probably about 350, something like that, maybe 350 apartments. And everything else pretty much in the Meadowood neighborhood is residential, single-family homes. So I think we've got maybe 1,300 homes, families that define the neighborhood. So so like I say, we don't nearly have the kind of commercial activity and things that Justice is talking about. We've got 2 M&As in Madison. There's the Marquette Neighborhood Association and there's the Meadowood Neighborhood Association, and they're about as different as they can be, basically. But we Meadowood's seen a lot of transition. So I've been here over 40 years, and so I've seen the changes that have taken place in the neighborhood, where when we moved in, like no one locked their doors. It was very quiet neighborhood. People kind of knew their neighbors, and we had very little crime or other issues, right, that happened 40 plus years ago. And a certain transition happened with the neighborhood where within some of the apartment buildings, we ended up having sort of absentee landlords that maybe weren't screening folks as well, because I knew people who lived in these apartments who said, multiple folks had, keys to a given apartment, and there'd be just open parties night after night and open drug deals. And so probably at about 15 to 20 years ago, there was some real issues and problems that occurred in the neighborhood, where we had started to have things like shootings, a murder, and a lot of the reputation for the neighborhood really went downhill. The city put a fair amount of focus on the neighborhood, and what I tell people, one of the best things that happened to us was Commonwealth Development coming in and purchasing a number of these apartment buildings where we'd had real problems with the landlords, and the police can't deal with landlords that don't live in the city either, or don't live in the state. And Commonwealth redeveloped, completely improved all of those apartments. Our on-site managers for the apartment owners, and things have improved significantly in the neighborhood. And the city put in things like a neighborhood resource team, and we've got a number of nonprofits that have worked hard in Meadowood to help improve the lives of the whole community, but especially our low-income neighborhood. Unfortunately, I still talk to people. I actually had a friend not too long ago, like a week ago, say, "Oh yeah, I've heard things about Meadowood. Like it's a terrible place." Meadowood's a lovely neighborhood, and it's a terrific place to live. And we have, I think, wonderful assets. our library. We've got a MSCR a community center that specifically works with the youth in the neighborhood. We're surrounded by several schools. We don't have any schools in the neighborhood, but right on our borders we have Orchard Ridge and Akira Toki, and on the other side we've got Hegel Elementary School. The Neighborhood Association primarily focuses on trying to build cohesiveness in the neighborhood and working on public safety and helping people see that everyone, that is all the neighborhood, has a role in public safety. So that's all I'll say right now.
Thank you. I definitely want to come back to hear more about some of those specific efforts. I think that would be
Julie, I think something might not be working with your mic. Or Lynn, sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. I had a microphone glitch. I had to switch. Terry, thank you for that. I was saying I definitely want to come back and hear about some of those specific efforts, because I think that's important, kind of that grassroots, members of the community coming up with efforts to make change. So thank you for sharing that. Abba, if we could switch over to you and get Northside.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks. It's nice to be back. I have been involved with Leadership Greater Madison, I think, for 16 years or something now. So I most recently was the executive director of the Northside Planning Council. I had been with the organization since 2001, first as the associate director, and then I left for 6 years and came back and became the executive director. So just, I'll sort of share about the Northside in the context of NPC a little bit, because I think the stories are, in some ways, the Northside exists because the Northside Planning Council was organized and it sort of branded the Northside in a way. The Northside, when we talk about it, is sort of the area along the North Sherman and Packers corridor, so around Warner Park, the airport, and it's one of the more quiet and occasionally neglected parts of town. And so back in the early 90s, when we saw an increase in violence and drug activity, particularly around Vera Court, then and future Mayor Paul Soglin, past, present, and future Mayor Paul Soglin, had heard of the Planning Council model from the Twin Cities and took a contingency of Northside residents up to sort of visit and see what that was all about. And essentially what it was a coalition of neighborhood associations, and it was based on a grassroots organizing model that helped develop leaders in the community to sort of shape the future of their neighborhood. And two of the first projects that the Twin Cities Planning Council that they visited had engaged in was building a community center and starting a community newspaper. So a community gathering place, and then a way to share information and create an identity. So they came back, and the city, United Way, and the county invested in creating a planning council, and hired its first facilitator, who was there for about 6 months. And then they hired their executive director for the next 8 years. And so they embarked on a plan to build the Warner Park Community Recreation Center and to start publishing the Northside News. So, the Warner Park Center is actually there because the NPC developed a public-private partnership and did the foundational fundraising to get the center built, did the community-led design process, and then basically told the city, we don't want to own it. We're glad to have it, and to have it built. And then the city took it over as part of the Parks Division. So that was kind of initiated through the launch of the Northside News. So in 1993, NPC was incorporated. 1995, the Northside News was published, the first edition, and the very first cover page was launching the Warner Park Center fundraising and development plan. So Warner Park Center opened in 1999, still there, still beautiful. The Northside News is now in its 26th or 7th year of publication, 6th year, I think. So that's kind of where we started. And those two things really transformed the North Side in a lot of ways. Shortly after Warner Park Center was built, NPC took on working to get Troy Community Gardens into a conservation easement, an agricultural conservation easement, along with then the land right adjacent to it, where we work to build a co-housing development in partnership with Friends of Troy Gardens and the Madison Area Community Land Trust. So those were some of our initial projects that transformed the land. But what I will say about that is that the foundation of that work was really transforming the community, right? Like it was about, there were these community development projects, and they were ultimately what is lasting from it, but what looks on the surface to be lasting from it. But what really came from it was the leadership development. It was engaging residents and helping them learn how to make these things happen, and having them take the lead. And so for the longest time, NPC's executive directors were not called EDs, we were called facilitators. So I came on as the associate facilitator in 2001, right as we were incorporating the Friends of Troy Gardens and sort of moving into the co-housing development. We took on a variety of other projects at that point. We expanded Lakeview Library. We started the Northside Farmers Market. This was at the time when Roundy's Corp came into the Madison area and bought out all the Kohl's stores and left us without a grocery store. They shut it down because they had converted the one on Highway 30 into a Kops, which was their brand. But then this one was too close and wasn't efficient for them. But the problem is they had a non-compete clause on the lease. And so we couldn't have another grocery store that wasn't within walking distance. So we actually did a lot of organizing and advocacy work around that to get the city to ban those types of non-compete clauses, and to get the Roundy's CEO to allow a grocery store in that shopping center. It's capped at 25,000 square feet, which is why we see what we have today. We had Pierce's Northside Market, and then now we have Willie Street North there, which in itself, there was a lot of complexity as to how that ended up happening, but that's sort of why we have the store we have there now. So then over the years, NPC was involved in a ton of community organizing. So we organized 18 neighborhood associations and worked on a whole slew of land use advocacy, schools advocacy. A lot of my work in the early 2000s was related to the school district's equity policy and how what their allocation formula was based on poverty levels at each of the schools. And so that was kind of our early phase. And then back somewhere in the mid 2000s, right after I left, actually, and after the executive director I was working with left, both of us were community organizers. And at that point, they hired planners into that role. And so what came out of that actually was the idea for Feed Kitchens, which is a food business incubator. And they had done a community-wide planning process and found that food entrepreneurship, food access, food cultures was like a very important focus for Northsiders. And so Feed Kitchens came out of that project. So nowadays, NPC is this interesting combination of various food systems programs and then community capacity building work. But again, I share that about NPC because that kind of traces in many ways how the Northside got on the map and sort of what some of the development of the Northside has been over the years and why you see some of the physical landmarks that you see there. So I just recently left at the end of March. And I'm now doing anti-racist consulting work around the city, but a lot of that is focused. NPC was very involved. My role had been to help facilitate a collective impact approach to public safety and violence prevention through a federal grant project called Safe and Thriving. So we are working on a peace, justice, and resilience plan as the next phase. And I'm also working to help provide backbone services to the Northside Early Childhood Zone, which is really looking at investments in early childhood development as a long-term systems level way to bring about public safety, right, and violence prevention. And so, as well as many other positive impacts. And so anyway, that's kind of where we've been. And I don't necessarily know where NPC is going to go now that I'm not there, but I know that's sort of where the north side is at.
Excellent, thanks. Really helpful just for building that context, Abba. That's, I think every time we have you speak, we go, okay, why isn't this just being replicated identically across the community here, across the whole city? And for lots of reasons, we know that that's not always the same approach, right? The approach that's going to work. So we love hearing about what's all the different things. So now we turn to Jason, who will talk about probably our most well-known, I would say, neighborhood in our community. Give us a little background, if you would, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with such a distinguished panel. Abba and Justice, I think we should make note of Justice's amazing joke in the chat. Very good, very good. It had me laughing at a time when Terry was saying something I shouldn't be laughing at. So I apologize, Terry. But well done, Justice. It's been too long, my friend. Haven't seen you in a while. But this is for all of you that are on the call with LGM. This is an amazing cohort, not me included, but the other three amazing cohort of neighborhood leaders in the city that are doing the work and getting stuff. It's amazing to learn about everything that's happening with Commonwealth, Northside, and Meadowwood. So Downtown Madison Inc. Is an organization we've been around for, well, about 50 some years. We originally started out of the Chamber of Commerce in the 1970s when we saw a lot of changes in downtowns across America. The shopping malls were being created. You saw the local sort of retail scenes changing and moving out to farther distances. You saw, white flight. You saw many different things happening in the downtown, and the downtown was changing, and a series of leaders brought businesses together to sort of understand what was happening and to work together. And it started as a membership-based organization, and we still are. We spun off on our own about 35 years ago or so. And we have members of all different shapes and sizes, about 500 different member organizations. Many, actually, it's a good picture, the group that's on this call today, of who are our members. You've got members like Justice at Commonwealth and Maggie at Rise and Margarita at the Latino Academy, but you also have larger corporations like MG&E and Whipley and Alliant and many others that are on here that really all care about downtown and want to see the neighborhoods, many neighborhoods that are downtown thriving, that it is one of the hearts of our community. Really all roads, because of the isthmus, lead through downtown and want to make sure that it's a strong economic, cultural, political part of our city. And so these members come together to build that better quality of life and sustain for and plan for the area. And they do it in three ways. First, it's through community building. So we run a whole series of events, maybe 100 events a year, where our members, and when an organization joins, I should note, any one of their employees are members. So virtually everyone on this call is a member of DMI, and they come together and just network and socialize and meet each other and business development and get to know each other. And a lot of the nonprofits connect on their projects. I can't wait to get back live, which we are doing in a couple of weeks here at Bree Stevens. And that's a big part of our work. It's just making those connections between people and creating the spaces, that power proximity, where that innovation, that creativity, where different people come together to do different things. And that's why it makes downtowns so powerful. We also do a lot of advocacy work based on our membership in four main areas: in economic development, in equity and inclusiveness, in quality of life, and in transportation. And our ideas on our advocacy come from our members. We have an intricate system of committees where our members can join in, and they create a civic agenda where we work with the city, the county, sometimes the state, really to advocate on behalf of those different tenets that we have here in our downtown, and things we're trying to grow from, advocating for more quality schools and downtown childcare, to identifying, confronting, and dismantling structural and cultural barriers that impede everyone from enjoying opportunities in downtown. You name it, lots of things here: multimodal transit, BRT, lots of different things happening within our civic agenda. And then lastly, we have a policy research team with our cohort we have with our friends at the La Follette and then Institute, who actually serve as two graduate students that help do our policy research. So we write policy research reports on a whole series of things. Most recent one was on what is a purpose-built shelter, the conversation about the East Side facility, the potential East Side facility, people were sort of getting lost is what is a purpose-built shelter? And so we helped to define that and look to 6 or 7 other cities like ours that are running facilities like that, just as help level set the conversation. We are not a neighborhood group in particular. Obviously, the Northside Planning Council is, Meadowood is, and then where Justice is working with Marquette, the MNA and MNA, they're more neighborhood associations. Downtown is actually made up of a whole series of neighborhoods. And I'll go original screen share here and show you a map of what we consider to be downtown. This is the downtown core sort of area in here. I feel like a weather person where everything is backwards here, but we consider the Yahara River. So right, just what Justice was mentioning, his area, choose Camp Randall Stadium as being the greater downtown. The shaded area is the Business Improvement District, which is a group we help administer. That is a series of property owners that agree every 5 years to pay an assessment, an additional tax for marketing, promotion, and events. It's the only business improvement district in the city of Madison. There is one in Sun Prairie, and there are 35 of them in Milwaukee. And then the other area, sort of the greater area here, you have is a central business district. But we really see a lot of the growth happening in the Marquette area, the Tenny Lapham area, Regent, Vilas, Bayview, the Canna area, the Campus Area Neighborhood Association, the South Union Campus Property Owners Association, and then main area in the center here is a bunch of neighborhoods, actually collective neighborhoods called Capital Neighborhoods Inc., which we have a strong partnership there. The president of their neighborhood always sits on our board. It's made up of 5 very small neighborhoods. So Midland, James Madison, First Settlement, Bassett, and Union South, State Langdon area associations. They're very small neighborhoods. So they all work together to get things done. I got to say, though, this is a really important topic, neighborhoods. That is where the real work is, right? We all live in neighborhoods. We all are in neighborhoods all the time. And that is the root work of things that can really change. And so to be on this panel with other leaders has been an exciting opportunity. I look forward to getting everyone's questions and learning more from the group at LGM.
Excellent. Thank you all. I would definitely invite the class to begin, you can submit your questions via chat or chime in. But I think what would be helpful, we heard a lot of, as you were speaking, a lot of commonalities in the organizing and the collaboration, which is just such a huge, important piece of the work you all do. I'm curious as to the unique challenges, and you highlighted them a little bit. But if you could highlight sort of what are those unique challenges that you're dealing with your specific areas?
I'm going to complicate this a little bit if I can. Where I worked, I was in Boston before coming back to Madison, before I was in New York. In the Bronx, there's 1.7 million people. There's 900,000 children in the Bronx, and there's almost 500,000 children with asthma. And I say that just to say that there's more children with asthma in the Bronx than there are people in all of Dane County. And so we get the idea of neighborhoods and boundaries, it lends itself to something that I think is very problematic when this is a very fluid, and one of the things with Commonwealth, why we started working citywide was because we started having a significant investment in the commons. We run the career centers for all of the high schools. And when you start seeing that your neighborhood, specifically your lowest income neighborhoods, are turning over at a 50% plus rate annually, I think about the story of the Teresa Terrace Neighborhood Center, and there was a lot of challenges with how that happened and how it went down. But a lot of it is because when the city started doing their community organizing process, they were working with the people in the neighborhood, which is a good thing, and all the organizations and everybody else. But the people who have the highest incomes tend to stay in an area, whereas a lot of our lowest income people leave. Now, what happened there was by the time the city went through their whole process, almost 40 months later, all the residents in the neighborhood were like, we don't want this to look this way. We don't want it to operate this way. And the city was like, well, what do you mean? We came out and we did all the well, it's right. But if you wanted to talk to the people who were going to live in the neighborhood when the neighborhood center came up, you should have been talking to people in Truax, Because by the time you get done with your process, that's who's going to live there, not the people who are there right now. And I think there's a number of things, and I can get into a different conversation about the structure of our government, aldermanic districts, all these things. But there are a number of these things that I think are very much structurally undercurrents that affect our ability to operate as a city, because we're not so, I mean, the isthmus, and I appreciate Jason, I will say I had, when I was in grad school one time, I had my advisor made me write on a chalkboard, like Bart Simpson, the definition of a center, because I was doing my work on Madison. And she kept on saying, well, where is the center? And I would say it's the capital. And the center is a point on a plane that has equidistant to all other points on the same plane. By definition, the isthmus is not the center, by definition. Now, we're trained to think that way because of the way that land use has happened in Madison, where, and that's how, if you follow it way back in terms of who had access to land. Now, this, I can extrapolate on this in my academic work. I get into this as it relates to TIF and all these other things. Now, I say that just to say that Madison has a peripheralization effect because of the isthmus, but we're not so big that we can think about it in such exclusive terms, right? We have to be thinking about our commons, right? Our school districts, I think our ecosystem. We're seeing that with the flooding and the way that the pavement and the way that we use land at an elevated part of our west side affects the flooding on the east side because of the nature of the watershed. I mean, the ecological implications of this, I think, are very, very real. And so I think a challenge, just to answer that question, is that, well, we all have very unique characteristics in the individual neighborhoods throughout. I grew up in Madison. I lived in 19 places before I was 18, before work construction, and I went to the Marines for a while. I think a challenge is that we have to figure out how to maintain some of the unique character of the enclaves that exist throughout, while progressively and aggressively recognizing our shared commonalities and our future. As long as you have a car, you can pretty much get anywhere in Madison in 20 minutes. Take a bus to get from Kennedy Heights to Teresa Terrace, it's 2.5 hours. Different conversation, different therapy session. So that's a challenge. I think, how do we recognize and appreciate the uniqueness of our respective enclaves while recognizing that we all have a shared trajectory in terms of our future and our commons?
So I have a much, I don't know, I just think in a more concrete ways, I guess. And so I'm going to talk to you in a much narrower, smaller box than Justice is talking about. And as I look at Meadowood, so there's no question that there's a lot of inequity within the neighborhood, because we have our, basically low-income apartment areas, and we have the greater, mostly privately owned individual single-family homes. And the neighborhood association has, not so effectively, but one of our goals has been to find ways to connect those two areas, because we want one community, we want one Meadowood, and that doesn't mean we see ourselves as separate, right? We've got Prairie Hills, we've got Green Tree, the surrounding neighborhoods we work with. And in fact, recently there's been the development of the Southwest Madison Action Coalition, which Commonwealth has been very integral in putting together as it's a bridge from a community-based crime reduction grant that the city received for the Southwest Madison, and the whole issue of SMAC is to how do we help people connect to resources that are needed in things like housing and other needs. I'll tell you what, some of the ways in which we've, the assets and I think uniqueness that Meadowood has brought is we have a woman named Sheree Wallace, who is an African American, and she's just like a fireball of energy. I don't know when she sleeps, but she establish a Medwood Health Partnership, and the Neighborhood Association is fiscal agent and really a sponsor for Medwood Health Partnership. And what Sheree has done is help make sure, particularly during COVID, that needs of individual families, when we talk about public safety, we have to understand the needs that individuals and families have and help support those needs so that we don't move into a crime violence cycle. And Sheree is very much, and Medwood Health Partnership is very much focused on that in trying to make sure that people don't get evicted because they haven't been able to pay their rent. And she's worked closely with Tenant Resource Center and the rent money that's been coming from the federal government for that, making sure families have things like food cards, gift cards when they're running out of food, and diapers and laundry detergent, and connecting them to resources for medical help, bringing doctors and people from UW Health into the neighborhood to actually meet. I mean, it's the closest we have to doctors going to people's homes. That she'll set up basically a little clinic, and people can go in and speak to doctors that otherwise don't really have access to medical care. And the other thing, the other transition, but Sheree is still part of this, is that in the fall of this year, as part, I mentioned that CBCR grant and SMAC, as part of that transition, one of the things, the West Side Police District, and we work very closely with the West Side Police District, they're terrific, Captain Patton and all of the staff there, instituted a community safety worker pilot. And the concept was that you take somebody who's well connected in the neighborhood, and that person works with individuals. When a police call comes in, a lot of times the police calls are fairly low-level challenges, like somebody's walking around the street and they're homeless because they just got kicked out of their house, a teenager, right? Or a kid is panhandling up at Walgreens, and that's illegal, right? If the police come, they give them a ticket and it costs them $100 or $200 or something. But you bring in your community safety worker who, talks to that individual, figures out what's happening in the family, and Sheree having the free food cards and gas cards and some other resources that the police do not have. I mean, the police can write tickets, right? They can take you to jail. They can try to call someone. But to have somebody on site to say, here's some resources for you, and let's help connect you to the needs. Let's give you something you need right now. Do you need a hotel tonight? That is making a difference in the neighborhood, and it is a model we are hoping to build on to reduce the need for police intervention and be we talk about having mental health support in the neighborhoods, right? But you need somebody who's able to come and deal with problems right now. And that's one of the points of this community safety worker, and as people that know the neighbors, know the neighborhoods, and are trusted. And that's what this whole pilot, a community safety worker pilot, is based on, and we're hoping will be extended through a grant that the police department is now seeking. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ava.
Lynn, do you mind repeating kind of what the prompt was for this section, just so I make sure I'm on point?
Well, I mean, I think just we were looking at challenges just because we see a lot of commonalities, but I think if we have an understanding of, like to Justice's point, maintaining unique. Go ahead, just challenges, unique challenges.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, I want to speak to Justice's point as well about kind of the artificial boundaries that in reality we place, because it is very true, the high mobility rates among low income residents means that those neighborhoods are constantly changing and turning over, right? And so that right there is a challenge if you want to do place-based community organizing. And it has always been one of the things that we really sought to do is integrate, for example, those mobility rates in the school district allocations formula, because having that kind of turnover really impacts kids in terms of trauma and broken connections with personnel at in schools and in neighborhood centers. We hear this a lot, like that youth talk about how they finally got to build a relationship, and then either they had to move, or because, in some of our, particularly when we're trying to bring in staff with lived experience. So I would say another challenge that we face, and this is true everywhere, is that, the nonprofit sector and our government institutions are white led, and that doesn't always create the kind of spaces for us to be responding to the experiences, shaping our responses around the experiences of people with lived experience, right? And that's actually one of the very real challenges that we see on the north side, is that the high turnover rate, even at our neighborhood centers, in part because of climate issues at nonprofits, but also, but then the kids themselves are moving, right? So in the end, if relationships are really at the core of how we move things forward, which I believe they are, in terms of building power and grassroots leaders and, enacting change that reflects people's experiences, that is a fundamental issue of how we build long-term and lasting relationships, and that have a lot of authenticity to them and communication. So one of the things that's interesting for me as I move out of being the director of a neighborhood-based nonprofit is I am now working in various parts of town and trying to find ways to capture those relationships even as people move from place to place, so that we can continue to engage even if they've moved out of a certain neighborhood. So, I think some of the other barriers, implicit in that issue of relationships is trust, right? One of the programs that we piloted through our violence prevention federal grant was the Neighborhood Navigators. And it was their role, the intention was to hire folks right out of the neighborhoods that are the least represented, and to provide professional development opportunities while having them help us build relationships in those neighborhoods and do outreach. And what we found, which didn't surprise me, but was, I think, offered a challenge, right, was that those very navigators also had such fraught histories with these very institutions that were asking them to do outreach on their behalf, that they struggled to be out there saying, I don't trust this institution. I don't trust social workers because they represent CPS. I don't trust the police. And you want us to build relationships with the police, and you want us to tell residents that it's safe to come into police and resident listening circles. And the last thing residents want is for their faces to be recognized by police officers. So our issues of mistrust are deep and institutional and rooted in trauma and are not easily addressed. And so I think that, some of the tools that we have then, are really to engage leaders with, like we did with the navigators, with lived experience, and to really listen to them about what the core of that mistrust is, to shape our programs around that. It was interesting because our federal grant wasn't flexible enough for that. A lot of our navigators left feeling like the work that they really needed to do wasn't the work that the grant could fund. And so I have now learned to shape those proposals around the work that the community is asking us to do, right? Easier said than done. Funders don't always want to do that. So on the flip side of this is working with those funders, right? Is working with the government institutions, is working with the Madison Community Foundation and EVU. And so those are relationships we've really started to build around how do you come to this in a responsive way rather than a top-down model, right? Which is implicit with white supremacy culture? How do you do this in a way that is relational? Anyway, these are big systems issues. I am not pretending that they are straightforward, but I think, you know, to a lot of our, you know, I think again, like this is regional, this isn't neighborhood, and yet we work at a neighborhood level. So how do you move back and forth on those scales to be able to address systems issues? And it's even bigger than regional, right? But regional is maybe a chunk where we can address quality of life issues, where we have some power and influence over some pieces of that, that an individual neighborhood wouldn't. So I'm not sure how helpful that was, or if it was just more confounding, but.
Good food for thought, and it's exactly the kinds of things we've been talking about in terms of looking at these big systemic issues and figuring out what change can be made. Trust point is a particularly important one, I think, because that is built locally, and so how you scale those trust relationships is critical. I'm going to, Jason, if you wanted to chime in, and then I'm going to take the spotlighting off so that we can just have a full conversation.
Yeah, I think I caught what you said there. I just wanted to say, you know, well, Abba and Justice had some really interesting points about where we center our thought and our language in our community, right? And oftentimes it is, honestly, it's centered right here. And we've made choices to do that. And I think one lesson that I hope I learned, State Representative Francesca Hong once pulled me over and she said, you know, Jason, in your language, when you're talking about your neighborhood in your area that I work with, you oftentimes say it's the center of the city. And I think that that is really troubling language. And I took that lesson and she said, actually, we have, and I know Diara and I have had this conversation with Annette and a few others, is about, for Madison to succeed, you have to have all of these different hearts succeed, right? You need all of these different areas, whether or not it's Sherman Avenue. We're obviously a street-based city when it comes to commercial, which economic areas, which I'm talking about. That has to succeed, as does Willie, as does Raymond, right? The area that Terry brought up earlier, as does downtown. And all of these hearts have to be beating together and working together for us to do what Abba says, more of that regional change, because we can only do so much in each neighborhood. And there are trust issues in each of these neighborhoods. And there are trust issues actually between the different organizations we see here in Madison. And I'm hoping one of the, I don't want to say positives coming out of COVID because there's a tremendous amount of suffering, but what we've seen, I hope, is more connections between different organizations that are doing this work, and that they can then build relationships to build these stronger systems, right? Because take an issue of affordable housing. It's also a transit issue. Justice is absolutely right. It takes 2.5 hours to get from one point to the other. You can almost walk it on the transit system in a faster way, but that is, you can't, people with disabilities, that cannot happen. And so you have to make sure that we're seeing this in the entire system. And then that means, I think all of the organizations like the four of ours need to be working better together to make this happen. So I think that this is a really important conversation about where we place our priorities, who gets what resources, and how we're all working together to make sure that our entire community succeeds. Because if the entire community succeeds, I think we're going to be in a better spot than just downtown succeed.
I'm going to take off the highlighting so that we can have a full kind of group conversation, invite everyone back into it. So I will do that and invite the class to pose questions if you have them. Great. There we all are together. Wonderful. Yeah, go ahead.
Like when ownership is so challenging, why you know, how do you get around that if somebody knows they're not going to be there in a couple of years and doesn't see it as their vision of the city? You know, how do you kind of mend that trust? Or I don't know what.
Well, I could jump at some of that. I think that trusting, so to Jason's point, this is an academic thing, so I apologize that it gets a bit, the trust versus mistrust thing, that's an old part of human development, right? And so that trope of trust versus mistrust, I push against it a little bit. I don't know that it's about not trusting. I think we absolutely trust each other to be in very volatile situations as it comes to funding. I absolutely trust that there won't, that we're dealing with scarcity of resources. And so I'm very much, we're big fans, we're very much schools of trust as it pertains to the lack of stability. So we trust that people are operating in a very unstable environment, because there's this story that, and I know this isn't what anyone meant, but there's a story that in terms of intellectual evolution, right? As a human being, as you develop, that one of the stages is you get to this point of trust. And I push because a lot of times the story, and there's a number of great, I could just sit here and start piping off name dropping a library of studies that have been done that have suggested that in really low income neighborhoods, primarily communities of color around the United States, that there's this issue of lack of trust. And I don't think it's a lack of trust. I think we trust that all of us are dealing with a number of toxic things. But I want to, so first there's that. Now, one of the things with this concept, though, right, in terms of stability, is focusing on stability. There are a lot of things. I could nerd out about that government structure stuff forever. Sometime, ping me, we can have a glass of milk and we can talk all about it. But the focusing on stability, I'll say that when you look at the feeder neighborhoods, that go into our low, so the lowest income feeder neighborhoods into our elementary schools. When you have a school, I'm thinking Lincoln, I'm thinking Orchard Ridge, Mendota actually has done a lot of the work that's happened on the north side to stabilize, when the turnover has actually gone down in some of the north side neighborhoods. Now, the north side, again, is, I've kind of talked about, there's a number of different smaller sub-neighborhoods. So there's a difference between what the current contemporary state of Vera Court versus Brentwood in terms of turnover. But when you have an elementary school whose lowest income feeder neighborhoods represent over 50% turnover annually, I don't care if you have Yoda in that school, the child is going to have a hard time learning, because so much of especially early childhood education is based on relationships. All of us know this, so focusing on stability and having a focus on stability is I think a very real way. Again, let's jump into this, but if you think even about housing, a lot of housing is about getting people into housing. It's not about tenure. So just from now on, pay attention to the dialogue and discourse around housing. A lot of it's about whether people are getting into housing, not whether they're staying there for 36 months plus, right? And we know that, like, in terms of behavior modification, as we're really looking into, Tara had a good, an interesting point up there about the focus and where our gaze, or where our ambit of operation is in terms of the income distribution. But one of the things is, that what you're looking for is full employment at a living wage for 36 months, and you throw in stable housing, and that's where you actually can do a lot of work. So I think, again, just pay attention to that in terms of the way that we talk about things like housing, and whether we're talking about keeping people in housing or getting them into housing. Again, not necessarily exclusive, but not necessarily the same thing.
Question for the group. We talk about turnover. I've not been in Madison as long as some of you have. I'm curious if you could just say what you think are the top reasons that people move on from neighborhoods in particular in Madison. I could guess at some of them, but I'm just curious to hear what y'all think.
Well, I think probably the root of it is housing and employment instability, right? And so folks, and the quality of that housing. Like, a lot of the residents that I've worked with in the past, when they move, it's because their apartments are not up to code, that the landlords haven't, like, there was one apartment complex where there was a fire and the landlords just ignored, like, post repair work. And then again, having to do with, like, if they end up not being able to pay rent, or they end up being moved by you know, or evicted by the landlord for whatever reason, we just see them kind of floating around. I mean, there's like, people will go somewhere, right? So what we see is a constant displacement of folks. But that's, I mean, I think Justice, you might have a little more insight just as a housing organization, but that's what I know from the residents I've worked with over the decades.
Yeah, I mean, you know, all of us just kind of getting a sense of who's on the, you know, I had to just kind of Google everybody in the class and just trying to figure out who everybody is. I mean, all of us probably can get a sense of what these things are. I think I would hit on a number of them. I think the non-renewals. So there's different ways people can be displaced out of housing. One is eviction. I think that's the one that people talk about a lot, is eviction. The two reasons people get evicted are payment of rent and lease violations. Those are the main reasons to get evicted. Now, non-renewals are a more subtle thing. And non-renewals, there's a lot of purview because you're on a lease, right? So the lease, that's a 1-year lease. And as a property owner, you don't have to keep anyone in there if you don't want to, right? After a year, you can now renew somebody. The kind of rule is you have to do it for no reason, just don't do it for any reason and you're clear. So you can now renew them, and that is a tool that property owners use if there's issues that you're having, chronic issues, you know, things that are not necessarily as explicit about lease violations. You know, like over the pandemic, it turns out a couple things happened. First of all, well, I'll just say there's been an increase of people noticing the smell of, we'll call it CBDs in their apartments. And so there's a lot of CBD use, a lot of people dealing with stress and, you know, no, but there's a lot of, now in a big unit, you go onto a floor, and I had to walk through this with some alders once. And I was like, you know, and actually we didn't smell any marijuana smell at all. We smelled incense. And I said, just go tell me which unit it is. If you can tell me which unit that incense is coming out of, because so what do we got as a property owner? All I can do is send letters to everybody saying, hey, a reminder, there's no smoking in the units, you know what I mean? But like, we can't. Now, property owners, though, they start to get a sense of where this is coming from, and they realize that they're having an idea. And then they say, you know what? We're not getting through the person. What we're going to do is just now renew them at the end of their lease, and we now renew them. Now, again, those are, you know, there's any number of reasons. The other thing I think is not as punitive as this concept of the cliff effect. Hopefully we all kind of have a general sense of that, but basically it's the idea that there's subsidies that are offered to somebody. Now, if someone were to get that promotion, so basically if you get, this is a very broad strokes way to say this, but like if you're making $12 an hour, you can't get promoted to $12.75. You got to get promoted to about 25 in order to cover for all the benefits and the subsidies that you're going to lose by that promotion. Now, that's just in terms of just regular income. But the other thing is that the way the city has created a lot of its, I would say the majority of its low-income housing has been with home funds or federal funds. Now, what happens with income restrictive units is if folks make over so a lot of these federal, it's hard to see a lot of these federal programs as being anything other than, in my opinion, punitive to your lowest income folks, because they require a type of surveillance that isn't required if you rent in a market rate unit. So like when I move into a unit, I don't have to recertify my income, get references and all this stuff every year. I just sign a lease and then I renew the lease. I do that one time when I don't even have to do that when I move in. I have to have certain, you know, the landlord, property owners are going to have certain requirements for, you know, income verification, credit check, etc. But then once I'm in, I'm in. Your low income renters have to recertify every year. Now, if they get promoted and they get a job, so let's say that the program, whether it, let's just say it's one of Sheree's able to work with somebody and hook them up and they get a really good job and they get a promotion. Now, they have to move. Now, to Tara's point about that lower middle class, generally speaking, so this is a great example of Meadowwood. You have very, very low income units and then really expensive houses. So there's nothing quite in the middle. So there's no way to move them into that middle ground housing in the neighborhood. So how do you feel about Sun Prairie or Fitchburg or somewhere else where you can find lower moderate income housing, because, and so you're going to move your kids, right? And so again, there's these things that are kind of in place that that promote it, right? And but I also think that just generally speaking, not having a focus on it. So again, it's not Rodrigo, he's talking about with the retention, recruitment and retention. I think there's a lot of that with housing. The same thing is that it's like getting people into housing, but no one's asking the question about tenure. So once folks get into your housing, how long are they staying here? And what are you doing? When we talk about getting subsidies from the federal, from the city or the county, what are you going to do to ensure residents stay with you for 36 months plus? That question is never asked. It's never been, right? Like that's not something we consider when we're creating housing.
Tara, go ahead. I see your hand up. You can jump in.
I really appreciate what you're sharing, Justice. And I put it in the chat and I feel like it wasn't very clear. And so I just wanted to introduce this other idea into my experience with housing programs is that really what I would call a Band-Aid approach, right? So we put people in housing, especially if you're coming out of a homeless or a housing instability situation, there's all this trauma and all these lived kind of learned habits that go along with becoming chronically homeless and needing those type of programs. And then we get people into housing programs, provide them a physical structure, and then wonder why it's a challenge for folks to maintain that or to leave those programs. And I see it from both a systemic and individual space, knowing like what it is to live survival economics. There's not a lot of resources out there that support a change in mentality, right? A change in our relationship to economics, to go from a space of scarcity to thinking about wealth development, especially talking about what you just touched on, Justice, about that fine line between receiving support and pricing out of it. It can be very simply, I've seen people lose things like childcare over a quarter an hour, which made no real impact in their life, other than losing that resource. And so how do we support folks who are experiencing trauma, have learned generations possibly of survival economics versus capacity growing and development, and then say, then we have the systemic side of it. The systemic side is that programs are about how many people they have housed. There's issues with HUD if we have a bunch of people all of a sudden become unhoused through programs, right? So it aligns with the funding coming into our county from a federal level. And so then it feels like there's more pressure on keeping folks housed at a minimal level that doesn't provide growth for their family, versus creating programs that do things to change mentality and prepare people to get out and to be stable. And so a lot of times I feel like people are disabled, not to use that lightly, but disabled by some of the programs. I myself was a Section 8 recipient as a young mom, and then I realized that I was, foregoing goals and dreams because I was focused more on being able to maintain affordability in the house with the Section 8 voucher, right? And so instead of thinking about how did I become a better role model and become more upwardly mobile for myself and my family, I was thinking about how do I keep this house that I currently can afford and a lifestyle that, while it was low income and benefits based, felt comfortable because I was no longer frustrated between the rent and the groceries. Right. And so how do we support people to move from survival economics to a space where we can grow and develop wealth, is to sum up what I'm saying.
I'm not going to pretend to answer those incredibly profound questions, but they were exactly, some of the right questions, right? And thanks, Tara, for sharing your, perspective and experiences around that. I mean, I think, wealth building is a very complex and fraught issue too, because how we build wealth in this economy, I mean, in some ways, it is the economy we have, right? And so wealth is important, and yet enabling and feeding that system that's deeply exploitive and is seeing, so much wealth getting filtered to the top, is actually it's an interesting thing to think about. How are we trying to shift people into wealth building mode to what ends ultimately, right? So thinking about some of the, for me at least, a very, it's again, not a straightforward answer, but I look at some of the solidarity economy tools, generative economic structures, like worker-owned co-ops, community-owned land, looking at basically, are we, trying to get people in the rat race, or are we changing the race, right? And that's big again, and yet there are some micro tools that we can use at our, if not a neighborhood level, a regional level. And then it is, I very much appreciate what you shared around, suggested around mental health and trauma and helping people get beyond survival mode, because that is definitely kind of that place of when you are in, when you are, when your life has been a lot of accumulated trauma, having safety and stability is your primary goal. And so growth is sometimes destabilizing. To Justice's point, I mean, there's a benefits cliff built right in, right? And so anyway, just some thoughts there, but but the complexity of what you're asking, or, what you're bringing up is very real.
We just have about 3 minutes left of this section. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I thought maybe if we could just go around with our 4 speakers and kind of give a last thought. You've given lots of really important kind of context for folks to be thinking about as we go out and kind of explore these areas. And really, part of our hope was that all of this discussion, this information would sort of help our looking, our seeing to be a little bit different, to look at things differently and look sort of beyond what, when you ride down Sherman Avenue, that's, you see what you see, but what's really there and how did it get that way, and, those kinds of things. So I guess with the last, maybe 30 seconds each or whatever, if you have just a thought about ideas that you would like to just offer in terms of, what to look for as you're out and about that you might not otherwise see as we're looking at our community.
Do you have an order? I'll go. So one thing I'll say, I always say this with housing, this isn't for the faint of heart, right? And that's real. But I also, there's this concept of returning to the center, right? And coming back to the center, I remind folks to remember the concept of love, and not like the Hallmark, but like the bell hooks construct of love, right? And I have this thing I wrote about love in the community poetic, and our community in the love poetic. And I think it's really important that we're stepping back and we're thinking about that. I think a lot about it with housing. Like when people say, what's good housing? I always say, could you imagine think about the first time you fell in love. It doesn't have to be with the person, with gardening or reading or writing or running or cooking or whatever it was. And then when you think about housing, could you imagine somebody falling in love in that space? And what would it take to think about a space where people could fall in love? And I know that it's interesting because it's sometimes that's more jarring to some folks than other things. So don't forget, to center yourself and to be thinking about love.
That's excellent. Thank you, Justice.
I think the main thing I think that we have focused on is finding ways to help people feel connected. And we've discussed relationships before, and I think Justice's point, you want to be a space where people can fall in love. That in a neighborhood, we want the people who live in the neighborhood to feel connected with each other, not afraid of each other. And that finding that goal and helping everyone feel like, yeah, I'm in this together, we're working together, and achieving the kind of neighborhood we want together is one of the most critical things I think we can do.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Justice and Terry, both of you, I appreciate that. I think for me, one of the most transformative frameworks that I have come across in the last few years that's changed my work is looking kind of looking through a trauma-informed lens. And it isn't to approach the world through a deficit-based model. I want to emphasize that. I don't think people are permanently broken, but I do think that trauma is intergenerational. It manifests somatically. In terms of our physical health. It manifests in terms of our mental health, our self-image, our self-esteem. And I think that that empathy that gives us in terms of seeing that so much of this work is about healing and helping people heal themselves and heal from within, and then creating communities, housing systems that are healing, because I think that unless we're mitigating some of that chronic and intergenerational trauma for people, we're going to be stuck in a lot of the same cycles. And so we need to give people the tools for that. So I think for me, if I were to think of, a handful of tools, that would be one of them that has really altered the way that I do my work.
I mean, these are excellent of connectedness, looking at trauma-based, and DR's comment in the chat, an area that my wife works in very heavily. I think for me, I have to make sure to center everything through empathy, what Abba just said at the end, and empathy for our fellow people, understand what they're going through, what we're all going through, and then a willingness to learn about our community and to dig in and to learn about new ideas and try new things to make them work. So I just want to say thank you for the panel for being here. I learned a tremendous amount from the questions. I always learn. Justice and I have been on panels before. I always learn a lot from Justice and Abba, and I'm excited to be on more panels with Terry and Abba in the future. And Lynn, thank you for this excellent opportunity, and to all of you guys for all the work that you guys do. So thank you. Keep up the amazing work.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for that really rich conversation. And I think that you just centered it beautifully. There are systems and there are structures, and there are more than one way to look at things, and kind of keeping people and connections and relationships at the center of it will, I believe, help us put the pieces together in productive ways for everyone. Thanks for your time, everybody. It's really great. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for your participation in that and your attentiveness. That was a lot of content, really, I think, wonderful perspectives, and so appreciate their sharing that. We are just right up before lunch, so I want to kind of clarify what we have going on. The idea is to give you, and as you see, we blocked out like a good amount of space, a good amount of time for you to just spend some time with your small group, exploring, really. And I think, there's a good likelihood that you have been to that you've been to the area that you're going to be visiting. And you might want to just start there. What do I usually see or do or think about this area that I am going to be exploring a little bit further, and just start there. Maybe share some things with your group about that. But then using that, everyone have access to that community asset inventory. As you go out, I think that, this idea, it's so not black and white. It's so not, this is good and this isn't good. I think we are looking for things that are working, things that maybe aren't working, things that are replicable, things that are opportunities, things that maybe just don't make sense. Really, this is an exercise in observation. This asset inventory that we created is, it's pretty deep. I mean, it takes you into a lot of things about healthy communities and aspects of communities. And I would encourage you to take a look specifically at that, the grades, the report card piece of it, because that might just help you sort of center your conversations as you think about economic stability. What are those things in this area we're exploring that demonstrate there is or is not economic stability? Where's there potential for building more and equitable economic stability? Same thing with education, social and community context. So this, are there assets within the community that encourage and support people coming together in the way that we've talked about is important for growing communities. Health and healthcare and neighborhood and the built environment. So how do you get around, are there spaces to gather, et cetera. So I think at a very base level, if you just used that as your kind of guideline for exploration and discussion, that would, help center you. The rest of the pieces on here, I think, are also valuable, so you could certainly reference it. But what I invite you to do is really just spend some time there. And if you decide you want to go into a coffee shop or sit outside after you've, explored, definitely do that. But just have some conversation about what we heard from our speakers, what you know walking into this, and then what you're seeing when you're there. And how do those pieces come together? Are there any questions about the kind of what the goal is? Okay. I will remain available. So if you have questions while you're out and about, I'm just gonna put my phone number again in here so you've got it handy. I'm gonna go ahead and put you into you have like 7 minutes or so to talk with your group that you're gonna be exploring with so that you can come up with logistical, kind of meetups that you might wanna do. I'll offer this up so you don't have to spend a lot of time like Googling. I'm going to put in the chat suggested locations for you to meet, just because I thought it'd be easy and get you started there, and it's kind of the center and you can explore from there. So 1219 Sherman Avenue is the address of the feed kitchens the feed kitchen facility that Abba referenced, and I would recommend that's probably as good a place as any to just convene, and then you can decide where to go from there. And if you want to, for the team going to the Meadowwood area, 5740 Raymond Road is the address of the Meadowwood Neighborhood Center. So that kind of talks a little bit about that community gathering space that's there, and the library is very near there and things. So anyway, so just to give you a starting point. I would suggest that the virtual team, and I'm sorry I didn't think about this before, but I'm gonna have to move, and so I'm gonna have to take this Zoom down until later when we get to Olin Park. So would someone on that virtual team be willing to send a Zoom invite for your kind of convening, your virtual convening? Tiara, I know in the past, I think, or Maggie, you can do that. Is that all right?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so if one of you would just send, maybe Maggie, if you would send an invite to Sarah, Diara, Tara, and for yourself. On the Park Street one, there are a lot of activities, kind of going on, a lot of like plans and things in place. So I think that's in South Madison in particular, there are a lot of, discussions being had about programs and things, kind of research and buildings and development, all kinds of things. There's been a lot of talk. So I would invite you in that case, on that virtual side, to go ahead and sort of look into some of those efforts and kind of match it up to what we've been talking about. Do those, does it look like those serve the goals and the outcomes of these areas and some of the things that we're talking about? So I would invite you to think about future and kind of planning as well as what's there physically for that particular neighborhood, just because I think there's lots going on. Okay, I'm going to just give you a couple minutes with your teams so that you can group yourself. Do you need that? Or do you just want to meet and do it when you're there? Just meet at the locations that I suggested and do it. Should we just do that? Or would you prefer to go into a breakout room with your teams?
Then I had a question. Is Harrison going to be joining us for this group? Okay, and he knows we're going to meet us?
He will, yeah. We'll have to text him because we weren't sure, how it was going to play out. But so yeah, we will make sure that he knows where you are.
For the Meadowwood group, I'd be comfortable just picking up the conversation there at that address that she suggested, if y'all are okay with that.
I think that makes
with that too.
Okay. I think that makes sense because you've got like, I think if you get to Olin Park by 3 o'clock, I mean, no earlier than 3 o'clock, that just gives you a nice amount of time to just really be there. And like I said, explore and stuff. So. Okay, and then I will, when we get to Olin Park, at 3, is it 3 o'clock or 3? So 3:30, I will open up this Zoom room again so that you guys can join back in, and we'll try and, project, and hopefully we'll deal with sound as best we can. But so that you can sort of hear the debrief of the exploration and you can share what you've had, and we'll be back together again. All right, excellent. Enjoy your exploration. I look forward to seeing you at Olin Park. I have a few snacks and some beverages, but I would encourage you to grab a chair if you want, or a blanket to sit on. And we will meet kind of where we did the pickup, so just behind that building on the grass there, on the where that pickup was.
For anyone in the Meadowwood group, if you want me to print off that neighborhood assessment, let me know. I'm print right now. If you want me to, just let me know.
That would be helpful for me.
Yeah, if you can burn a copy for me too, please.
All right, so 3 copies.
I have one.
Rita, are you good?
I have one.
Okay.
Anyone from the north side have access to a printer? Because I don't. But
yeah, I just printed off one. How many do other people want copies?
I would love one. Thanks.
Yeah,
so
I'll
much.
print off one. I'll print off one for everybody since Harrison's not on, in case he wants one too.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Are we good then? We're just going to meet at Feed Kitchens at 12:30.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Full disclosure, I'm going Zoom casual to the meeting. Interpret that how you will.
Pants or no pants?
Zoom casual. I'll just leave it at that. Bye, everybody.
All right, see you soon.
All right. See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, Lynn. Sorry, I just returned. So I think everybody's heading out to the event. I'm going to try to get permission to venture out next time. Our company's been really very locked down. So it's not necessarily my beliefs, but they've just been pushing, like, if you don't have to be out, we're asking you not. And because I'm like the head of that area, I'm just really, like, I got to walk the walk that we're telling everybody. So it kind of puts me in a bad spot, but I'm going to ask for permission. And I think we're going to start returning back to the office within the next month. So I think that will give me by June, by the next time we meet, I'll be able to easily start to venture out. So.
Got it. Okay. Now I completely understand that. And I knew that was going to be the case. With MG&E, I know on, some of their areas are doing the same thing, and I, have dealt with a couple of others. So I totally get that, which is why I think this virtual option is good. Like, even, for Maggie, that maybe wouldn't normally need it, but it works for today. I think it works great. So what's going to happen is Maggie is putting together a link that you're going to get as a different Zoom invite link, Sarah, because you'll be on the virtual team with them. Because I'll have to shut this one down and as I'm, moving. And so Maggie will send that link, and you will work virtually to kind of do the exploration that we've talked about. So it might be some research, sharing of screens, discussion, reflection, however you want to do it. But that's the goal.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Maggie. I just saw it.
Awesome.
It's Sarah, Tara, and Diara, right? That's the only other ones other than myself.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I had all the emails on there for the invite. All right, I'll see y'all later. See you, Sarah.
Bye.
Okay, Julie. All right.
Yeah, I think that went well.
I think so too. Yeah, it was big, and then it was small, and it was kind of like, wah!
Well, but so many cool ideas coming out of that. I mean, I think that if they were listening and taking notes, there were resources that were mentioned that that'll be really helpful for their projects. And